Good morning to our panelists. My name is Chee Ling. I'm the Executive Director of the O Network, and I'm very pleased today to be moderating the first of a series of roundtables that's organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Today's is actually organized by the Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations. So we have today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be discussing the Sustainable Development Goals, and the topic is Focus in Continuity, Sustainable Development Goals in Malaysia, with also a reference, obviously, to what's happening globally. So today we have with us three panelists with a lot of experience from different perspectives who know each other. So I'm very looking forward to a very interactive discussion. So we have Puan Zakiah binti Jaafar, who is currently the Deputy the Secretary General for Policy at the Ministry of Finance. She has been a stalwart for many years before moving to the Ministry of Finance in the Economic Planning Unit, where sustainable development from 1992, when the Agenda 21, Agenda for the 21st Century on Sustainability, was first adopted by heads of states and governments in Rio de Janeiro, to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda adopted in 2015. Puan Zakiah has actually been the steward at the national level in translating these international United Nations programs of actions and commitments of governments into national actions. So we will hear what are the challenges and how far we have come on that. She is an economist by training, has done a lot of policy work, so we look forward to the discussions with her. And then we have Dato, Dr. Yusal Yusoff, who is currently Principal Fellow at the Institute of Ethnic Studies in UKM. He's been there for a while. In between, he's been pulled in to help set up a lot of very interesting institutions in the country. He was between 2015 and 2020 seconded to the PM's department, where he served as the Deputy Director General of the National Centre for Governance, Integrity and Anti-Corruption. And he was actually quite instrumental in also setting up the Malaysian Institute of Integrity. And this is part of actually implementing one of the Sustainable Development Goals, which we will talk about later. And prior to joining UKM, Dr. Anis was more than 10 years with the United Nations Development Programme. And so he comes to us both with the United Nations background, national work, and implementing a cross-cutting Sustainable Development Goal. Then we have Loong with us, the third panelist, who is actually here with me. And Loong has more than 20 years of experience in public policy and in advocacy. He has been very active both at the civil society level, think tank level, worked with state government, and also the federal government. And he has been attending quite a lot of United Nations meetings, especially around climate change. He played a very pivotal role in setting up national policy on trade, investment, and industrial transformation during his stint at the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And he was also part of Malaysia's negotiation team for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP negotiations, where he was hands-on looking at how economic trade, investment policies, and sustainability have to be actually brought in harmony. So we are very happy that he's here today with us. And currently, Loong is a senior research officer in the Khazanah Research Institute. And he has a very multidisciplinary academic background with degrees in chemistry, environmental technology, and cultural studies. So we have a panel that is as broad as we can imagine in terms of experience and background. So welcome again. So I want to move quickly now into our discussion. Basically, just to set the context, the 2030 Agenda is something that is not new when it was adopted in 2015. The journey for sustainable development at the United Nations level for member states of all the United Nations family to turn into national and local action started really in the late 80s when the negotiations for one of the biggest agenda for transformation, because it was a recognition in 1992 when the big Earth Summit of the United Nations Environment and Development Conference took place, recognizing that our development models based on the Western model, fossil fuel based, was unsustainable. that it was unsustainable production, unsustainable consumption. This was recognized by heads of states back in 1992, the biggest gathering of the heads of states and governments in the world. And we were given the hope there will be a major shift, and they actually used the word paradigm shift, from unsustainable development to sustainability, with the 3 pillars on environment, social, and economic development. So the journey started in 92 with Agenda 21, principle, global equity, national implementation, of course, national equity, and inclusiveness of all in society to be part of this transformation. Of course, implementation has been weak. We also have not just the UN programs, we also have legally binding treaties. We have the Climate Change Treaty, we have Biodiversity Treaty, we have treaties to restrict the use and export and import of toxic chemicals. So there are a lot of legally binding international law as well. So this whole package was reviewed, and in 2015, when there was a big next leap into the 2030 agenda, which we are talking about today, it's not just about the sustainable development goals. These 17 goals and the 169 targets are only a few pages in a document that is actually 35 pages, which actually captures all the commitments in the United Nations family of member states since 1992. And that's important for us to know, because implementation is not just about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but about all the package of legally binding commitments. And so that is something for us, and a challenge that I'm sure Zakiah has had to do. So this actually means that the implementation of sustainable development and the goals that we have today, which we are targeting to achieve by 2030, is not the responsibility of one ministry or one institution. And so we will be talking also about the mechanisms of how to make it work at the national level. So I'm going to jump into the getting our panel to react to some questions. So my first set of questions is that in the 2030 agenda, it's very clear that these 17 goals are indivisible and are integrated. So we don't pick and choose, right? From poverty, education, to agriculture for security, to women's equality, and to partnership and inclusivity, the whole range. So I would like to hear your reactions on Zakiah first. How do you implement indivisibility of the 17 goals and targets into national policy? Please.
Right. Thank you. Assalamualaikum and a very good morning. Thank you to Madam Chee and IDFR for having us. I totally agree with Madam Chee in that the concept of sustainable development is nothing new to us here. But the SDGs does provide for a convenient, standard and integrated framework to assess how holistic a development is. So to the uninitiated, Malaysia has been adopting this concept to some extent since the 1970s with our affirmative action to reduce our poverty rate and restructuring society. And if we touch on conservation, Malaysia has been practicing sustainable forest management since 1901. That is why we managed to almost eradicate absolute poverty now. And we have a vibrant middle class, and our forest cover is still above 55%. So in 2015, when we signed on to the Agenda 2030, it was easier, not easy, but easier for us to institutionalize all the SDGs within our existing policy framework through our 5-year development plans, beginning with the 11 Malaysia Plan. So since then, all the SDG targets have been embedded within our medium-term national targets, so policies can be aligned and resources can be allocated to achieve the SDGs. This way, monitoring is also easier because we use existing platforms to do so. The 12th plan, which was just approved by Parliament last month, continued this practice. But I am also pleased to share with you that our annual budgets are now fully mapped to all the SDGs too. So currently, all of our 6,755 development projects and 1,171 operational activities have been tagged to the relevant SDGs. We are among the only 10 countries in the world so far and the only nation in ASEAN region which have successfully done so based on UN's assessment. So we are now finally able to identify any financing gaps and seek alternative funding sources to support the SDGs if need be. So in terms of reporting the progress of SDGs, we do this in multiple forms. The Department of Statistics is our focal point in establishing and maintaining our SDG database and portal. The dashboard is available online. And reporting wise, we presented our first voluntary national review or VNR at the 2017 high-level political forum in New York and subsequently in July this year, so twice now. Malaysia is committed to submit its VNR every 4 years from now on. Both reports are again available online from EPU website. And for the first time, the SDGs is also updated in our 2022 Economic Outlook document available online. So this will be continued annually. So you don't have to wait for the VNR. So that's some update for you on how we embedded the SDGs in our policy framework.
Thank you very much, Zakiah. It's very useful to know that the annual data is going to be available and integrating sustainable development indicators, targets into economic outlook, because that's been one of the gaps. We'll come back to finance because it's good that you are now in the finance ministry where the financing is going to be decided. I want to come to Dr. Anis because you have done a lot of work. In light of what we've heard, the SDG 16, which is cross-cutting across linking in terms of this, what we're talking about, mechanisms for monitoring. And I just want to read for our audience information. SDG 16 reads, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So Dr. Anis, you have been working for years to implement this within the government system and also outside. Please, I'd like to hear your experiences and some of your thoughts.
Thank you, Yolene, for that question. I would like to start this discussion perhaps to remind ourselves of this old saying of a Red Indian group. They said that Mother Earth is not something that we inherit from our ancestors, but something that we borrow from our children. So if we borrow it from our children, I think we have to take good care of Mother Earth, so that when we hand it over to them, they are still in the good shape. I think that is an important concept to understand what sustainability is all about. I remember in early 1990s when I used to do some work with the Tamia people in Sungai Pilus, I realized actually they have been living a sustainable lifestyle because they are nomadic. They live in one village and they use whatever surrounding the place, and then they move on to another place. So I have to look at the schedule every time I want to go and visit to see where they will be during that period. So this is nothing new, and certainly we are ahead of many countries in the country. And I must also congratulate people in the leadership position in the country for putting the context and the text in the position so that we can understand and this can be monitored and reported easily. But I think beyond that, before I answer your question on the SDG 16, I think that the worrying bit is whether people are aware about all these things that's happening at the moment. I was listening a few nights ago on a program where they were talking about aligning SDG with the budget 2022, and listening to Datuk Johan Maikan and Dr. Zunika. I'm glad to know that a lot has been done and really fantastic work. It's just that I think people in the civil society movement are unaware of many of these things. So perhaps my suggestion to Zakiah is something that we need to learn how to blow our trumpet. We are good at doing things, but not very good at telling people. And I think that's important because we need to create the awareness for everybody to understand, because they can help. And I think certainly the ordinary people on the street, and this comes to the experience when we were doing and focusing on the National Anti-Corruption Plan, I started by doing a foresight. Basically because I think not just we're trying to deal with the problems of today, we need to look at the future, and the foresight helped us to look at what Malaysia would be beyond even 2030. We were looking at 2050 because I think 2030 is just going to come very soon. And this has been around, like what Ling mentioned, since 2015. But unfortunately, at this stage, since 2015 to 2021, I think if we do a random survey, and I did this for this discussion a few nights ago, I sent out to 5 different WhatsApp groups to ask people what is their level of understanding of SDG. And these groups are people, there's a group, a very intellectual group of people. There are some that I used to train, there are some civil servants. But unfortunately, not all of them seems to have a real understanding. So I think on average, they are between 1 to 10, maybe about 5. So I think important, because these are the people who's going to be implementing all the policies that we have from the top down. In the context of SDG 16, I've been arguing, in fact, one of the first thing I did was I wrote to the UN in saying that you cannot have a separate SDG for governance. Governance must exist in every particular goal. And of course, they agree and they said, and to be fair to the UN, if you look at every different, there is some component of governance mentioned. But I think it has to be more than that. But more important for countries like Malaysia, we cannot deal with poverty if the corruption and all these other leakages are happening. We cannot deal with issue of hunger if there are people who are stealing, the fishermen's money and all these other issues. Every one of those you have to cross-reference, and that's how we were trying to address and to look at. But the challenge really is that we are just trying to label. See, the danger of it is that we take what we are doing and then we find what is in the SDG and link it. I think we have to forget about SDG. I think otherwise it becomes a burden. What we need to look at in addressing the whole governance system is that we have to look at what are the priorities, what are the real problems in the country that we need to address. If poverty is the number one problem, what more post-pandemic? I mean, with the COVID, I just did some work for UNDP recently, and I look at the impact on human development is enormous, and we need to do more. If we think that we have done enough and we have eradicated poverty, but COVID has brought us a new dimension of problems and the other issues. So I think these are some of the things that is a challenge, but I think we need to think through together, and governance is so important. I'm just worried because when I relook at the midterm review of the National Anti-Corruption Plan, I saw some of initiatives which we drafted much earlier have been shifted, have been dropped. And this has to be something that we have to review. And I think I did discuss this with Ling. A lot of all these things that we are doing links with the existing legality framework that we have in the country. Our law reforms, I'm not sure whether we are doing in tandem to make sure that the laws that we have is not pulling us back or pulling us down from achieving some of the goals. Maybe I stop there, just as an opening.
I want to pick up what you said. In the beginning of your remarks, you said that there's not enough awareness of SDGs. But you've ended up by saying, let's not be trapped into this SDG framework. What are the bigger issues that we have to tackle, which is about the corruption, good policies, civil society, community involvement, and so that's a very interesting way of looking at it, because otherwise,
if I can answer, I think the link is that the problem people don't see, why I think awareness is important, because we have to see all the 17 goals is not standalone goals. It's all interconnected. If we don't take care of our river, our sea, there won't be any food and any sea, that we can harvest or the fishermen can make money from. If they don't have income, then there's other problem. We are dependent on import food, 14 billion a year that we're spending. Not just Malaysia, our neighbors too. We have to help them to take care. I mean, this is a concept of this planet that we are sharing, that we're living together. So it's not just Malaysia, and that's the awareness that we need to create. But at the same time, what are the priority areas that we need to address? If there is a baseline of some of these things, I think that's important for us to monitor, rather than just because we have to report to the UN, then we are doing certain things. I think that's something that we have to look at.
Thank you very much, Anis. I think you made a very strong point on that. And on that, I want to move to Shao Loong, because I think the sustainability, indivisibility of everything as one package is exactly what we're trying to emphasize here. So in your experience, here we may have all these aspirations, but then do we have issues around how we look at trade, investment, the kind of agreements we negotiate? How should that jive with the sustainability goal in all its three components?
Okay, thanks for the question. I think it's an important one, because we always have this tension of all-encompassing holistic agenda encountering the hard reality of silos, right? And agendas in silos. Trade is one of those, of course, where it's largely economic, but ultimately, when it gets down to these international negotiations, particularly the scope of what becomes discussed under really what is trade and investment agreements often stretches into many areas, almost all the SDGs effectively. You've got environment, you've got labor, you obviously have knock-on impacts on poverty as well. And one of the difficulties is, how do you reconcile that within a government where, in any government actually, where responsibilities are divided? You have a delegation of authority to, say, the trade ministry to go and negotiate on behalf of all the other ministries. Of course, there's some consultation for some topics like, say, intellectual property and legal matters. You get those relevant agencies and ministries turning up as well in the delegations. But it becomes very difficult if the negotiators in the front line don't have that sort of holistic understanding or an understanding of sustainability when they are in the position to make decisions, and decisions that involve concessions or compromises or even gains at the international level that relate to the national agenda. And so I think we need to do more in terms of even our negotiating process, in terms of reporting back, analyzing, not only after an agreement is concluded, but also before and during, to see what the impacts are. I mean, I'll give you one example. It wasn't previously the practice to say run the numbers on how well our outcomes were in terms of goods negotiations in a trade agreement.
You're talking about goods means import-export.
Yeah, the import-export, and effectively what is the trade balance, right? I think one of the things Malaysia is very proud of is reporting that we have an almost unbroken trade balance. I think it was only briefly broken for one quarter last year by COVID, but we've had it for like 22 years or 23 years by now. We've had this trade surplus. But when you go into a trade negotiation, of course, you're going to concede gains and losses on many different goods, and you may come out positive, you may come out negative. But it's important at the end of the day to know the numbers, because the trade agreement is fundamentally a commercial agreement, but it's a commercial agreement that has an impact on many lives and livelihoods throughout the country, down to fishermen, let alone big firms, let alone our GLCs as well. And it's important to know the numbers. What is the financial outcome at the end of the day, and the progress of that throughout the negotiations? And then that kind of information should be presented at the highest level, say to cabinet, where they can make a decision about how does the outcome in any given negotiation, whether it's trade or diplomatic, reflect and interact with and improve or set back any of our country's sustainability goals.
Yeah.
I think that should be the level of discussion.
I think that's a very important point, because I would actually, emphasize that, because people think that the sustainable development agenda is about environment. It's still quite a very widespread misconception, right?
Misconception.
Let's confess, even within EPU, there is a sustainability division, and then the economic division is much bigger, and then they may actually be not in synchronizing form with what you're trying to do.
We need to lobby that the sustainable division must be made bigger.
In fact, it should be overarching, right? So,
exactly.
The economic pillar of the 2030 agenda and its goals and targets is where there is always disharmony. So as you were saying, Shao Loong, when we go and do all these, not even trade negotiations anymore, I mean, things like the comprehensive and progressive, Trans-Pacific Agreement, they have 30 chapters, for example, on government procurement, on state-owned enterprises. These are the tools that in our development history, we have used to ensure that we can have social engineering. If we want to turn green, we can use our government procurement, which is controlled by the public and the sector and the government, to have green spending, for example. But once you, let's say, open up in your trade agreement and say foreign companies can come in and you lose control over how you want to direct your money, it will raise issues. So I think what we have brought up are very, very critical issues. So we'll take a short break because I want to come back next round to talk about financing. Because a lot of what we are talking about here means in the end, where and how will revenue be generated for us to finance our sustainable development plans. Thank you. Right, next, we are going to look at how do we then finance all these plans that we have talked about, and I'm not making the planning and the policy part easy. Obviously, as we had discussed just now, there can be contradictions in policy. So how do we have a mechanism that actually does proper coordination among the different ministries? No more silos. We always say no more silos, but in practice, we go back to silos. And within even same ministries, there may be even more silos. But that's something which is a continuing challenge. Now, let's come to financing. I was very happy to hear, Zakiah, you said earlier on that now in the budgeting, there is this alignment with our SDG goals and things like that. But there have also been some concerns, like even for our 2022 budget, that what we see in the 12 Malaysia plan and what we see in the budget, there seems to be still not enough alignment, but of course the plan is 5 years and the budget is annual. But I just want to come back to that. For a country like Malaysia now, especially with COVID, which has also created a lot of economic and financial instability and uncertainty globally, right? And there are discussions, in fact, today when we are having this discussion that is ongoing, the climate negotiations in the United Nations in Glasgow. We will have WTO, the World Trade Organization, is meeting at the end of November. And there are big fights there where the rich countries, the developed countries, are trying to change the global rules so that they will actually, not having met their international commitments on financing sustainable development, on ensuring transfer of environmentally sound technologies. This is the United Nations North-South, developed country, developing country agreement and commitments in Agenda 21, in 2030 Agenda, and in many treaties in the United Nations. And there's been a failure of implementation in the North-South or developing country commitments. And while we as a country must also align our spending and see how we can continue to generate revenue to finance, but it is never going to be enough. And this is why in the equitable relationship of developed and developing countries in the UN, there's this commitment to finance, right? So I just want to move the other way around and maybe ask Shao Loong first. In your experience, looking at climate negotiations and tracking what's happening, and SDG 17 talks about strengthening that North-South partnership. You know, we talk a lot about public-private partnerships, but SDG 17 is about the state-to-state international relations. That big partnership has to frame all other partnerships. So maybe some thought on your side in terms of the international commitment in international relations on financing, technology transfer. Where do we stand?
Okay, thank you. I think the sad fact of the story for these international commitments on technology transfer and financing is that, since the 70s they've been made, and there's been relatively little delivery. People are still talking about meeting their little percentage of the overseas assistance goals, these are European countries, of course. And I think now that things have changed, where we're not like in the 70s where, there's a big gap between sort of Western developed countries and countries like ours in the South. There are now other Southern countries that have risen up. They've acquired technology, they've developed technology. We tend to interact with them on the basis of firms, right? Firm to firm, sometimes government to firm. I think maybe there's more room to be explored in terms of government-to-government discussions about technology transfer. Finance discussions already happening, although I think sometimes it does lead us into sometimes onerous debt obligations, but I think there needs to be a bit more monitoring there. And I think you've seen, say, China rise up as a kind of regional power with its development bank. Some countries like Sri Lanka maybe have taken on a little bit too much. We comparatively less. But we haven't explored enough, I think, the potential for negotiated technology acquisition, technology transfer that meets our strategic needs. And these are strategic needs that are ultimately sustainable needs as well. So I think a lot of energy, effort, as well as our kind of fiscal expenditure is put on courting private investment. But I think we have to increasingly understand what the opportunities are in terms of negotiating technology agreements with friendly and, perhaps strategic governments as well.
It's an interesting point. I think the COVID experience, where we look at the whole debate around vaccines, the kind of government-to-government discussions between, let's say, Malaysia and China, or even with the Chinese firms, where we saw more technology sharing compared to where Malaysia, negotiates with, let's say, the Western pharmaceutical companies, where it was really buying and you really driving us hard with terms and conditions, not just for Malaysia, but globally. Some of the non-disclosure agreements have come out from Latin America, signed with Pfizer, for example, where it is so one-sided, it actually attacks sovereignty. So that's a very interesting point that you made about more government-to-government facilitation, which is what the United Nations programs of action and treaties were envisaging. You have governments facilitate, right? So let me come to you then, Zakiah. In your experience being in government, trying to get access to technology, while we want to finance, and we do finance in Malaysia a lot of our own development, but we still need external support. What are some of your experiences and challenges that you face? Please, Zakiah.
Yeah, so maybe excuse me, maybe I start first with, some inroads in public finance. As I mentioned, we have fully met the SDGs to our annual budget, so we can identify where the financial gaps are. Actually, there is analysis in one of the articles in our economic outlook, but very careful in interpreting the results, because clearly most of the allocation goes to SDGs that are related to physical infrastructure, so that is a huge amount of allocation there. Doesn't mean that the rest of SDGs, which have less allocation, is less important. Because the nature of programs and projects need not require that much allocation if compared to infrastructure, of course. And there are also other SDGs that are financially supported by other resources, such as external funding and donations. But to meet this funding gap, we will be establishing what we call a My SDG Fund very soon, I hope. And this is a platform for anyone, it'll be individuals, private sector and civil society, to contribute to SDG related programs and projects. It will be guided by a board of trustees, the chairman of which is a prominent sustainability figure in Malaysia, and it will be managed by an executive committee co-chaired by MOF and the UN resident coordinator in Malaysia. So this is a joint venture with the UN in Malaysia to meet this funding gap. But we know, and this is we know for some time now, that allocators of capital are now very much in tune and in tune in their decision towards environment and environment friendly investments and climate change issues. So we are fortunate that Bank Negara and Securities Commissions are way ahead of us in the MOF in ensuring that our financial and capital market are ready, to support this progress. So they've come out with a lot of guidelines and taxonomy for investors, for bankers, and are out there to ensure that this transition is also being seen in the finance and capital market. So there's a lot of work actually going on. And you know that in April of this year, we tested with our sustainability suku, and we were really surprised that the demand was there, nearly 6 times, demand from around the world to subscribe to our suku. So we know the demand is there. So in budget 2022, in April, we had a 500 million US dollars sustainable suku to support our environment-related programs and projects. But in budget 2022, next year we plan to have another similar suku of 10 billion ringgit to support funding in this area as well. So moving forward, we are developing an SDG, Integrated National Financing Framework. It's a mouthful. This is together with the UNDP, and this is supposed to be a complete, unified, explicit framework for sustainable finance, simply because at the moment we don't have line of sight what's happening in the private sector in terms of financing. And we will be establishing a sustainable finance roadmap. This is we work with the UK government as well. They have been generous to help us in many ways in this task, and so this will enable the government again to identify more financing gaps, if any, and suitable financing options for SDG related programs and projects. So that's about some of the progress currently we have here in MOF.
Right, before I come to you, Dr. Anis, I'm going to come back to Shao Loong, because I know he's been looking into the whole equity, capital, ESG, environmental, social, governance, financing. And talking about the UK is very interesting, because last week there was this big announcement by former UK central bank governor, Carney, that he has pulled together this 50 financial institutions and equity investment funds, and there's going to be 130 trillion US dollar assets ready to go into green financing and climate financing. And it turns out that actually it was a big announcement, but the 130 trillion were assets of all this together, and they have already been putting it into fossil fuel and polluting industries. How do you divest? And of course, within a week, not even a week, a number of these big banks have come out and said, oh, no, all these the net zero climate targets are too strong. So they're already lobbying to, and these are all voluntary pledges. These are not committed from governments, right? So I want to come to you, Shao Loong, because I know you've been tracking this issue and you are looking to the private sector. How do we turn the private sector financing green? Is it possible?
I think there are a couple of ways. I think one of the biggest ways that private sector needs is predictability and certainty about what is the policy direction. I think right now in the private sector, and that direction needs to come from government ultimately. Right now the private sector is split, and I won't say it's an even split. You have a split between those who have accepted and embraced the sustainability agenda. Mm-hmm. They really believe that's where the future of their business goes and where finance goes.
And not greenwashing.
No, not greenwashing. Mm-hmm. You find genuine ones, but I would say that's a minority. Mm-hmm. And you still need some certain champions. I mean, Mark Carney is a recent convert, of course. And then you have a much larger group, which is maybe either stuck in the old model, or they're a little bit cynical about ESG. They see it as something they will have to comply with. Mm-hmm. It may be an externally imposed threat, especially with, say, the EU and US trying to impose things like carbon border tax, mm-hmm. And trade measures. But I think the thing that will change it on a national level, and if it happens in more countries as well, you're going to see a global impact, is when government and sort of major regulators, like we've seen with our BNM here, WSC, send that signal that they take ESG, climate, with the taxonomies very seriously. Mm. And it becomes a requirement or an almost default expectation for the private sector to embrace, engage, and report on this kind of stuff. But ultimately, government must set the tone, because if they don't, mm-hmm. the private sector will parts of the private sector will find ways around it.
I think that's a very important point, because one of the things that came out in one of the panel discussions on the Kani initiative last week was actually a comment from the International Organization of Securities Commissions, of which I discovered Malaysia is actually a member of the executive board of this organization of regulators of private capital. It was very interesting because the chair of the commission of that organization actually said, and he's the Hong Kong securities chief, that if we are serious about green financing, we have to make sure that there are standards and that all these investors are held to account, because so far it's been voluntary. And when it's voluntary, then you run this greenwash risk. So I thought that was for me a very significant thing. And if Malaysia and the Bank Negara, as well as our Securities Commission, have started that journey, then the synchronizing, because in the end, if we don't get financing right, or the right investment, so the G2G and the government policy framework, I think that you mentioned are very crucial. So Anis, what do you have to say to this?
Can I go to another dimension of the discussion on the need to provide a financing modality for social protection?
Okay.
I when I was in UNDP, we did some work with SOCSO, and at that time we were trying to push for a coverage for self-employed. In Malaysia, even at that time, there were 300,000 people who are self-employed. I don't know, maybe the numbers are more now. But what does it mean? It means that if you are a taxi driver who drives your own car, and if you're sick that day, you go and see a doctor, you have to pay for your medical bill, and you have no income for that day. Do we have some kind of ways of how we want to provide some kind of coverage for this? I think we cannot have a kind of knee-jerk reaction to certain problems and then we come up with certain policies. I think we need to have a more comprehensive and consolidated social protection for the whole country. I mean, not just what COVID shows us, there are many other issues, but the thing is, it's not just COVID. There are many things will come and we have to be prepared for now. So the social safety net is something that I think is in need, that we have to really look long term. I'm just looking recently on people talking about the creative industry, not just the performers, the singers or the musician, but they also come with the backroom boys, the guy who helped to carry the set and the whole lightings and the whole. So during this COVID period, none of these people can earn any income. And what mechanism do we have for these people to have some kind of a coverage as a social safety net measure for them? I mean, if they start to contribute, if we perhaps do a kind of a special insurance program, some kind of contribution, that perhaps that can be a way, rather than government then have to spend money and like in the case of COVID, there are many different small grants given to people, but we have to think long term that this is not something that will happen now. I mean, this is a good lesson for us, but it could come in many different forms. So if we're not prepared in terms of financing the social protection, then we become a kind of welfare state that end up feeding people. So we need to think through, and that is something should be on the table also, which I've not seen so far. Maybe Zakiah can enlighten us if there is something along those lines.
If I may update a little bit, certainly, Dato, this is so true. And in budget 2022, PEKESO or SOCSO will extend this coverage to those in the informal sector. But that is because of COVID. So there is a council looking at reviewing our social protection net. So that work is also still ongoing. And it's a surprise because we've done a lot at federal level, but the state government, the religious institutions also have done a lot. So it's good to have an overall view of who gets what. As well. So, data is important for really good policy making decisions. So that's also another track that MOF is working at. Another thing, this financing, at the moment at MOF, we do have many carrots that we provided for so long. for this transition to happen. But while there is good progress, but maybe it is not sufficient if we want to achieve the net zero target. And when we look at other countries which seemingly have made good progress in climate change, in addressing climate change, they employ both the stick and the carrot approach. So the stick isn't, we do have, some sticks, but next year, I think when we have the Climate Change Act in place, I think we have a better approach towards climate change in this case. So there's a lot of work still, needed if you want to achieve this net zero.
Thank you. Now we're back to the last round, and I would like the three of you to share your thoughts. How do we then look at the next steps forward in the immediate term, the next 1 to 2 years, given still uncertainty, but how we can manage uncertainties and risks, and then the kind of longer term, your wish list. So I'll start with Dr. Anis.
Well, people say this is the tuna period, with turbulence and all this uncertainties and the novel and the ambiguity. I think what's important is that each and every one of us must try to understand where we can play a role in contributing to SDG, but in understanding our own needs and where we have. A country like Indonesia, I understand, they set up a SDG Academy. I know that there's some friends, civil society group that's trying to push for some kind of academy, but we need some, a more, a body that can help, because you can't rely, the UN is here to help, to support, but I think we have to take the lead, because this is really something that we need to look at. I think there is an important point for us to continue to coordinate all efforts. I'm not sure whether this coordination things are really, is there, because I know, I've worked, I think Zakiah know this, when we were doing the JACMA meeting and we used to call all the different agencies, and we know the challenge in Malaysia is really because everybody is guarding their turf. So for this to happen, to really achieve, we have to coordinate. Without coordination, then everybody will be running, doing their own things, and we're not going to be able to address the problem. We have to help ensure there is only one plan that we are coordinating, because if there are many different plans, then we have a problem. So the strategies, and of course the monitoring, the MNE must be in place. And I was looking at the dashboard yesterday. Good to know that we have achieved 70%, but still there are 4 or 5 still in stagnant position. 4 have achieved, and it's really moving forward. But these other areas that we are not moving and not doing enough is something that we have to look at. We need to look at international standards. I think we have to insist that we have to match up to the international standard for us to get to where we are. Otherwise, like for example, technology. Here we're talking about digital economy and digital this and digital that, but the infrastructure is so far behind. Education is one key goal, but during the COVID, we realized that this generation, the lost generation, kids in some rural parts of Sarawak and Sabah and other parts of even in Semenanjung, are not getting this PDPR, whatever we think is going to be the solution, because it's just infrastructure. So we have to find ways, maybe using television. The old TV pendidikan used to teach kids. We have to be more proactive about those kind of things. We need to create new culture, I think, in understanding and looking at the whole thing, because sometimes there is some drastic measures that we need to take to address some problem. In terms of corruption, you cannot just do a simple kind of berikrar that's not going to solve problem. This is a real cancer in society. We have to grow it. We have to amputate. We have to amputate the leg. We cannot just take it easy. This is not the time to go and tell someone who's having a gangrene that, you have to stop drinking sugar and taking sugar. Too late. So we have to take drastic measures. And last 2 points, I think we have to start them young. We have to educate the young. I mean, I remember when we were doing all this sustainable program, when we did the LA21 program, we were addressing at kindergarten level this recycling things. The kids are the one who knows. If we do a quiz, I don't know how many Malaysians know what color to put paper, what color to put. Although those things are being shown on TV days and because we never do. It's not something that we live. It's not a consumption lifestyle where we really go and throw and separate our waste. So we have to start the young, and the future is with the young people. And finally, I think perhaps in the context of promoting some of the things, perhaps maybe the government needs to have a social influencer. The social media is so reaching out, but we are not taking advantage. We're not using all this new technology in terms of promoting SDGs, in terms of addressing the needs of the country, in terms of making sure that people realize this is the country we live in, good or bad. Problems will be our problems. If we don't face it, if we don't address the problems, we're going to be part of the problem. So we have to work together. And I think these are key things and important message that we need to get it out so that more people will join us. I was joking with Datuk Dennison the other day. I said, maybe you should do a survey. We need to know from the 222 member of parliament, how many of them really understand SDGs. They need to understand, because otherwise policies, the laws that we are trying to do in the country will not be engaged in a way that we need, what the countries need. People like Zakiah and others who are in the government, doing the stewardship, implementing the thing will be there, and I hope more of Zakiah will be around. But at the same time, the politician has to also understand so that they don't come and contradict all these good things that are being done by just putting or doing things whatever they want to do. I think it must work hand in hand, and it has to be a coherent and a more concentrated effort from all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anis. So we want more Puan Zakiahs. Your proteges, I'm sure, all in ECU and all over.
Otherwise, we have to clone her.
No. Cloning is very unsustainable. We have to have. All right, Puan Zakiah, over to you.
First stop. Due to this twin health and economic crisis, we actually suffered 2 years of economic loss. The value of our GDP this year is less than what it was in 2019. But inshallah, next year we will surpass the 2019 level, inshallah, if there is barring any other event. But more worrying, the impact of this economic loss is that 580,000 BM40 households now fall into the B40 category. And our absolute poverty rate rises to 8.4%, which is unacceptable. And there are other yet to be a quantifiable impact from the pandemic. For instance, I do wonder about the quality of our education that our children received when they are forced to learn online. Education is not just about receiving information. It's about being a decent human. You need social interactions. That's 2 years lost, for this generation. And what about the impact of the lockdowns on the mental state of the people? And we have numbers, and very scary numbers showing, rising numbers of depression, suicide rates during the pandemic. And more often, children and women suffered more during these lockdowns. So certainly, all the SDGs that are related to our health and socio-economic well-being will be very much affected. But believe it or not, and I hate to say it, the pandemic does have a silver lining. So some of the SDGs that are related to environment actually improve during the period because of the lockdowns and minimal human activities. So we get to see how our air quality improves. Our GHG emission has somewhat reduced a bit. lessens water pollution and noise, and reduces the pressure on our tourist destinations, which may assist with the restoration of the ecological system. So we should not waste this momentum. But moving forward, what we need is to continue with reforms in many aspects. And I like to be frank here. Based on the current political landscape, I do wonder whether we have the will to push through all these reforms. So on the civil service side, what we were trying to do is to institutionalize or legalize these reforms. For instance, in Budget 2022, we have mentioned that we will establish this Fiscal Responsibility Act to ensure that the governance is there, the transparency is there in terms of fiscal management, no matter who is in power. And I think with the Climate Change Act next year, inshallah, that will also help to ensure that the reforms will be in place and be pushed through. So I think that is beyond my pay grade, but at least this is the best that we can do on the civil service side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zakiah. I think that was a really important point. I think in not just Malaysia, in many countries, there has been also a forgetting on the role of the civil service. Because the civil service really is, and I like to use the word steward all the time, because that is the trust I think that any society has, which is in the civil service. And that is something that we have as a legacy, and the independence of the civil service. When you said data, and then Ami says coordinate. Really, this is really what the civil service is about. And I would say data analysis, because the way I think government expenditure within the service has also, over the years, we see that we are collecting a lot of data, but our analytical part has also, because they're not funding the policy. I remember every ministry used to have a very strong policy division. And then we went into this outsourcing, to Pricewaterhouse, McKinsey, to do policy, and then we're coming back in the end, full circle, but we have weakened the policy analysis of our civil service. And that is something that's really important, because I think from the outside, certainly are always pushing for a stronger public policy role for the civil service. So thank you so much for that, and lots of things that we can think about working together. And over to you, Shao Loong, last words.
Thank you. I think one of the most important lessons that's come to me as a result of the conversation that we've had today is that we're in a very critical decade where we really need to raise science-based policy to the highest level. And that's because of climate change. We have 2030 goals, right? We have a very short decade left because we've lost 2 years already to the pandemic. And the pandemic has given us a very serious lesson about what the consequences of not catching up quickly enough with the science. And science needs to be the frontier of policy in these kinds of areas, right? When you don't catch up fast enough with the science on, say, COVID-19, you don't recognize that the disease is airborne, and that mandatory masking is fundamental to saving lives and protecting people's health and reducing the burden of the health system, then you strain the entire society. You lose livelihood, you lose jobs, as was mentioned before. Climate change is like the pandemic in slower motion. And if we don't incorporate the right kind of science into the sticks and carrots and the laws that we will be bringing forth, we are also going to lose lives and livelihoods. And I think it's particularly worrying that at the COP26 in Glasgow, the climate conference, the 200 climate scientists, including those who worked on the UN climate report, have come out and said that the outcomes of the conference don't reflect the science. Right? That means that the pathways that we take, whether it's the net zero or to preventing 1.5 degrees global warming, don't match up with what the science demands, right? So we have to make sure that not only do the efforts that we do in these kinds of policies answer to the SDGs, but ultimately they must answer back to the science, and they must adjust as the science also adjusts. We've seen in the last 2 years how every few months there's new scientific knowledge, every few weeks sometimes, about how the pandemic works, how we interact with it. So I think we have to take some lessons from that. I think there's some important lessons going ahead as well with attempts by many governments to say we're already in an endemic phase of the pandemic, but the virus doesn't care what we say or what policymakers say. The virus will make up its own mind, it will mutate on its own, and it may or may not behave endemically depending on how it interacts with our immune systems.
Yeah.
And the endemic phase will not be flat, it will be up and down, it will be choppy, and it will strain our institutions.
Yeah.
It will strain our economies, and it will strain our health systems. And we will have to manage these stresses along with increasing climate stresses as well. I know I'm ignoring a lot of other problems, but these are problems that cut across, right? We can see how powerful the pandemic effect has been on our lives and livelihoods. Likewise for climate change, where we're not ready for a lot of the impacts. I do hope that the Climate Change Act that comes out next year also takes into regard not just mitigation of reducing greenhouse gases, but also adaptation, helping the most vulnerable, socioeconomically vulnerable communities, those that have fallen through the cracks as a result of the pandemic and other shortcomings, to withstand the impacts of climate change that have already happened and that will happen as well. We need to build a more resilient society across the board, and science must be the tool. And I think government needs to become stronger in terms of absorbing and incorporating and implementing science-based policy.
Thank you. I think that's a very, very apt way to end this discussion, because I think with the science, and you use the term the right science, because science is also very contested. Science is also politicized, as anything else. So I think back to what we said earlier on about civil service, it's about independence. I think independence of knowledge and sharing, because in the last 2-3 decades, we see knowledge becoming private property, right? The privatization of knowledge. So whether it's climate change or the pandemic, or having to struggle with biodiversity loss, or poverty poverty has risen globally. That means we need to share data, we need to make knowledge and the benefits from the knowledge also global public good. I think the concept of global public goods has come out in a very big way in the last years. And this is something that we need to work towards. I think the other thing, of course, is also the transition. Zakiah used the word transition, because the 2030 agenda and its goals, the SDGs, talk about transformation, very fundamental change in the way we work with the planet and with society. But the transition is very difficult, not just finance, but knowledge, attitudes, perceptions. And the vested interests are going to have to give up a lot of the profiteering but polluting and antisocial activities. So that's massive. How do we do transition in an equitable and fair manner globally between the rich and the poor and within countries? When we make those changes, we cannot, as you say, put the burden on the poorer and more vulnerable parts of our own society. So that equity is also very important. And I think equity is very much in the DNA of Malaysian development policy. And that's something for us to remember and institutionalize. So thank you so much. That's one area that we didn't have time, but I thank Zakiah for raising it, is that the impact of any disaster, whether it's COVID or climate change, falls disproportionately on women and children. And one of the most important SDGs is women's rights, empowerment and equality, which we ourselves in Malaysia have a long way to go to. So that is something for IDFR to have maybe another round table on the whole issue of...
Just perhaps focus on just gender development.
That's right. Because there are many, many issues, and I think it's time for us to also look into that in a really, to deal with that whole issue in the way it deserves to be. So thank you so much again. We have taken the SDG discussion into a much broader context of where it should be, which is all the 3 pillars, reminded ourselves of social impact, economic, and environmental and human rights. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us in this discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you.